Say it again, under oath. The words didn't echo, but they landed heavy, like something dropped onto marble from too high up to ignore, and for a split second, even the hum of the courtroom air vents seemed to hesitate as Ava Brooks sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly, posture straight, eyes fixed on Officer Daniel Hayes standing just 20 feet away, his uniform crisp, badge catching the overhead fluorescent lights in sharp reflections that flickered every time he shifted his weight. His voice had been steady moments ago, confident, practiced, the kind of tone that didn't just tell a story but expected it to be believed without question, and now he repeated it, slower, firmer. She resisted arrest and interfered with an active investigation. Each word placed carefully, like bricks building a wall no one in the room seemed eager to challenge. The jurors leaned slightly forward, some nodding almost imperceptibly. The judge watched with a neutral expression carved from years of routine. And somewhere in the back row, a clerk typed quietly, the soft clicking of keys threading through the silence. Ava didn't move, not even when a faint murmur passed through the gallery, not even when Hayes let his gaze linger on her just a second too long, as if daring her to react, to slip, to prove him right. But she didn't give him that. Her face remained composed, unreadable, the kind of calm that didn't come from confidence alone, but from something deeper, something anchored. The overhead lights cast a pale glow across her cheekbones, catching the stillness in her eyes. And if anyone had been watching closely enough, they might have noticed the smallest shift in her breathing, measured, controlled, like someone keeping time with an invisible clock. The prosecution table remained quiet, papers untouched, pens resting idle, as if the entire room had collectively decided that this moment belonged to Hayes, that his version of events would set the tone, define the truth, and close the space for anything else. He adjusted his stance slightly, one hand brushing the edge of the witness stand, the faint rustle of fabric breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone that this was real, that this wasn't a story but testimony. And still Ava said nothing, her silence stretching just long enough to make a few people shift in their seats, to make the air feel heavier than it should have, because silence in a place like this wasn't empty. It carried weight. It asked questions without forming them. It made people wonder what hadn't been said yet. Hayes cleared his throat, subtle, controlled, but there, a flicker, a crack so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way Ava's eyes remained locked on him, steady, unwavering, not defiant, not afraid, just present, like she was listening to something beyond his words, like she was waiting for something only she knew was coming. And in that stillness, in that fragile pause between statement and response, the entire courtroom hovered on the edge of something it couldn't yet see, something that hadn't been revealed but was already beginning to shift the ground beneath their feet. The judge's pen hovered just above the bench as if even he was measuring the weight of what had just been said. And for a moment the room held its breath in a way that felt almost deliberate, like no one wanted to be the first to break whatever fragile stillness had settled in. Ava Brooks remained exactly as she was, shoulders relaxed, hands still folded, but now there was a subtle shift, something almost imperceptible in the way her gaze softened, not in surrender, not in hesitation, but in quiet calculation, like she was watching a pattern complete itself. Across the room, Officer Daniel Hayes straightened slightly, reassured by the silence that followed his statement, the kind of silence he had learned to interpret as agreement, as acceptance, as the absence of resistance. He glanced briefly toward the jury, catching a few nods, a few expressions that leaned in his favor, and that was enough. It always had been enough. His voice came again, smoother this time, more confident, filling the space with details that sounded precise, structured, convincing. She ignored repeated instructions and escalated the situation. He said, each phrase delivered with practiced ease, the kind that came from repetition rather than reflection. Ava listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving him. And yet there was no tension in her posture, no visible strain, just a stillness that felt out of place in a room built on pressure and reaction. A faint sound of paper shifting came from the clerk's desk. A chair creaked somewhere behind her, small, ordinary noises that suddenly felt louder against the backdrop of her silence. And then, almost unnoticed, Ava adjusted her hands, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, just a slight repositioning, fingers aligning more precisely. As if preparing for something that had not yet been introduced, the prosecution attorney glanced at her briefly, perhaps expecting a reaction, a denial, anything that might challenge the narrative forming in real time. But there was nothing, no interruption, no objection, only that same composed stillness. Hayes took a breath and continued, leaning slightly forward now, his presence expanding, filling the space with authority. "Everything I did was by procedure," he added, and there it was, the final layer, the reinforcement, the phrase that carried weight beyond the words themselves. Procedure meant safety. Procedure meant trust. Procedure meant he did not need to be questioned. The judge gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without committing to it, and for a second it seemed like the moment might pass, like the story would settle exactly where Hayes intended it to settle. But then Ava's eyes shifted, not away from him, but through him, as if something beyond his words had caught her attention, something internal, something already decided. Her breathing remained even, controlled, but there was a quiet readiness now, a presence that had not been there before, subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable to anyone who might have been paying close enough attention. Hayes paused just long enough to gather his next sentence, unaware that the pause itself had begun to change shape, that the silence he relied on was no longer empty, that it was no longer his. And in that suspended second, before anyone spoke, before any objection could be raised, before the rhythm of the courtroom could resume, something shifted beneath the surface, something quiet and precise, like the final click of a mechanism locking into place. Ava's gaze did not waver, but now there was intention behind it, something sharpened, something deliberate, and when she finally moved, it was so minimal that most of the room did not register it at first, just a slight tilt of her head, a quiet inhale, the kind of movement that did not demand attention but earned it anyway. Officer Hayes shifted his stance. Again, mistaking the silence for control, for momentum, for the steady progression of a narrative that had always worked in his favor, he adjusted his sleeve, smoothed the front of his uniform, small gestures that signaled confidence, routine, authority. And then he continued, adding another layer to his account, reinforcing details that sounded familiar, structured, safe. "She became uncooperative when asked to provide identification," he said, his tone unwavering, his words clean and polished, each one landing with the certainty of someone who had told similar stories before. The jurors exchanged brief glances, some writing notes now, pens moving slowly across lined paper, capturing fragments of what they believed to be truth. Ava watched them too, just for a second, her eyes moving across the room, observing, measuring, understanding exactly how the story was settling in their minds. And then her attention returned to Hayes, not with urgency, not with emotion, but with precision, like she was waiting for a specific moment, a specific phrase, something that would complete the pattern she had been tracking since the beginning. The courtroom clock ticked softly on the wall behind the judge, each second stretching longer than it should have. The air conditioning unit hummed above, steady and indifferent, and still Ava said nothing, her silence now carrying a different weight, no longer passive, no longer reactive, but active in its restraint. Hayes leaned forward slightly, resting one hand on the edge of the stand, grounding himself as he spoke. "At no point did I deviate from protocol," he added, his voice firm, almost final, like a closing statement disguised as testimony. And that was when Ava's fingers shifted again, this time just enough for the movement to catch the corner of the judge's eye, a subtle repositioning, a readiness that did not match the role she had been placed in. The judge straightened slightly, his attention narrowing, sensing something just beyond the surface, something not yet spoken but already present. Ava's shoulders remained relaxed, but her focus had sharpened, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, and yet everything about her presence now suggested that the silence was reaching its end, that the space Hayes had filled so confidently was about to be challenged in a way he had not anticipated. A faint flicker crossed Hayes's expression, not fear, not yet, but something closer to uncertainty, the kind that appears when a script begins to slip, when a familiar rhythm no longer feels entirely secure. Ava lifted her chin just a fraction, her eyes meeting his with quiet clarity, not confrontational, not aggressive, but unmistakably certain. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, before the judge could intervene, before the room could adjust, the balance shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been drawn that only she could see. And now, finally, she was ready to step across it. The silence finally broke, not with force, not with urgency, but with a voice so calm it seemed to cut cleaner than anything raised in anger. "Officer Hayes," Ava said, her tone steady, measured. And for the first time, every head in the courtroom turned fully toward her, not out of curiosity anymore, but because something in her voice demanded it. The judge leaned forward slightly, hands folding together on the bench, giving her the space without needing to announce it. Hayes straightened, a faint tightening in his jaw as he faced her. The shift in control subtle but unmistakable. Ava did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She simply met his gaze and continued. "You said you followed procedure." She paused just long enough for the words to settle, not challenging, not accusing, just placing them back in the room where everyone could examine them. Hayes nodded once, quickly, almost reflexively. "That is correct," he replied, his tone firm but no longer as fluid as before. Ava tilted her head slightly, as if considering his answer, her fingers now resting lightly against the table, still, composed. "And you also stated that I refused to provide identification," she added, her voice carrying clearly across the room without strain. The jurors looked between them now, their attention shifting, the neat alignment of Hayes's narrative beginning to loosen at the edges. Hayes hesitated for a fraction of a second, too brief for most to notice, but enough to register as a break in rhythm. "Yes," he said again, this time more carefully. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the response as if she were building something piece by piece, her eyes never leaving his. "So just to be clear," she continued, her tone unchanged, "you are testifying that at no point during that interaction did I present any form of identification." The question hung in the air, precise, contained, the kind that did not sound aggressive but left no room to move around it. Hayes shifted his weight, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath his shoes echoing louder than it should have. "That is my testimony," he said, slower now, choosing each word with more caution than before. Ava let a small silence follow, not long, just enough to let the certainty of his statement settle into the room, into the record, into something that could not be easily adjusted later. The judge's pen touched the page, writing, documenting, fixing the moment in place. Ava inhaled quietly, her posture unchanged, her expression still composed, but now there was something unmistakable beneath it, a quiet momentum, a direction that had been waiting for this exact confirmation. Her gaze softened slightly, not with emotion but with clarity, like someone who had just heard exactly what they needed to hear. Hayes watched her, his confidence no longer expanding but holding, contained, as if he was beginning to sense that the ground beneath the exchange was not as stable as it had seemed. Ava's voice came again, just as steady, just as controlled. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple, polite even, but they carried a weight that did not match their tone, because in that moment it was no longer a question, no longer an exchange. It was a line drawn, a point fixed, something that could not be undone. And as the silence returned, thicker now, more aware, it was clear to anyone paying attention that the direction of the room had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The word lingered longer than it should have. "Thank you," simple and measured, yet it seemed to press against the walls of the courtroom like something heavier, something that did not belong to politeness but to certainty. Ava Brooks did not move after saying it, her hands still resting lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, but the air around her had shifted, no longer passive, no longer waiting. Across from her, Officer Daniel Hayes held his position, but the stillness in his stance had tightened, his shoulders no longer relaxed but set, as if bracing against something he could not yet define. The judge glanced briefly between them, pen pausing mid-note, sensing the change even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. A juror in the second row leaned back slightly, the faint scratch of wood against fabric breaking the silence just enough to remind everyone that the moment had not passed. It had only deepened. Ava's eyes lowered for a brief second, not in retreat but in focus, as if reviewing something internal, something precise. And then her fingers moved again, this time deliberate. Controlled, she reached toward the edge of the table where a small, plain folder rested, its surface unmarked, unremarkable, the kind of object that did not draw attention until it was opened. Hayes noticed the movement, his gaze narrowing just slightly, the first clear sign that his confidence was no longer automatic. Ava lifted the folder with steady hands. No hesitation, no rush, just intention. The soft sound of paper shifting echoed more sharply than expected, drawing the room's attention. Without a single word needing to call for it, she did not open it immediately. Instead, she placed it carefully in front of her, aligning it with the edge of the table as if the placement itself mattered, as if precision was part of the act. Hayes shifted his weight again, the movement subtle but no longer controlled in the same way. His earlier rhythm disrupted, his certainty now something he had to maintain rather than something that carried him. Ava looked up again, meeting his eyes, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in her gaze. Not challenge, not defiance, but confirmation. Like a final piece had fallen into place exactly where it needed to be. "Officer Hayes," she said. Again, her voice unchanged, calm, steady, but now carrying a quiet authority that did not rely on volume or position. The judge leaned forward slightly, allowing the exchange to continue. The room now fully attentive, every small movement amplified by the silence surrounding it. Ava rested her hand lightly on the folder, her fingertips pressing just enough to keep it still. "You are certain of your statement," she continued, not as a question, but as a reinforcement, a final anchor point. Hayes inhaled, a controlled breath, but it lingered a fraction too long before he answered. "Yes," he said, his voice firm but no longer effortless. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the answer, and then she opened the folder, slowly, deliberately, the faint crease of paper unfolding sounding louder than it should have in the stillness. She did not reveal everything at once, only the top page, sliding it forward just enough for the edge to catch the light. The content still hidden from the room but clearly no longer irrelevant. Hayes's eyes dropped for a moment, just a flicker, drawn to the movement despite himself. And in that brief shift something changed, not outwardly, not in any way that could be pointed to directly, but in the balance of the room, because for the first time since he began speaking, his attention was no longer fully in control. Ava did not rush. She did not explain. She simply let the moment stretch, let the presence of what she held settle into the space between them. And as the silence returned once more, heavier now, more aware, it was no longer empty. It was filled with expectation, with the sense that something irreversible was about to be revealed. The page remained only partially revealed, its edge catching the overhead light in a thin, sharp line that seemed to divide the room into before and after. Ava Brooks did not look down at it again. She did not need to. Her attention stayed on Officer Daniel Hayes, steady, unbroken, as if the document in front of her was no longer something to examine, but something already understood. The courtroom held its silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It had weight now, anticipation, the kind that made even small movements feel amplified. A juror shifted in their seat, the faint rustle of fabric echoing softly. The judge's pen tapped once against the bench, a subtle rhythm that stopped almost as quickly as it began, as if even he sensed that interruption would break something fragile in the moment. Hayes's eyes flickered again, this time not just toward the folder, but toward Ava herself, searching, recalibrating, trying to read something that was no longer easy to interpret. His posture remained upright, controlled, but there was a tension now in the way his shoulders held, a stiffness that had not been there before. Ava let the silence stretch just long enough to settle fully into the room, not rushed, not forced, but intentional, like she was allowing everyone present to feel the shift rather than simply witness it. Then she moved, slowly, deliberately, sliding the page forward just a few inches more. Not enough for the jury to read, not yet, but enough for Hayes to see the top line. His gaze dropped despite himself, drawn to it. And for the first time his focus broke completely from the narrative he had been holding so tightly. Ava spoke again, her voice calm, even, but now carrying a quiet precision that left no room for misunderstanding. "Take your time," she said, not as a courtesy, but as a statement of control, the words settled differently than anything she had said before. Because they did not ask for permission, they assumed it. Hayes's jaw tightened. Almost imperceptibly, his eyes scanning the visible portion of the page, something in his expression shifting, not dramatically, not enough for the room to fully grasp yet, but enough to register as change. Ava watched him carefully, not with urgency, not with confrontation, but with patience, the kind that came from knowing exactly where the moment was leading. The judge leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing, sensing that the direction of the testimony had turned, though the exact point of impact had not yet been revealed. A faint hum from the ceiling lights filled the space between breaths, between glances, between the unspoken realization that something was no longer aligned the way it had been minutes ago. Hayes lifted his gaze back up, but it was different now, less certain, more guarded, as if the ground beneath his words had shifted just enough to make him question where he stood. Ava did not react to the change outwardly. Her expression remained composed, her posture steady, but there was no longer any doubt in the room that she was guiding the moment, not with force, not with volume, but with precision, with timing, with the quiet confidence of someone who had already seen the outcome long before anyone else realized there was one. And as the silence settled once more, deeper, heavier, it was clear that the next words spoken would not simply continue the story, they would redefine it entirely. The shift became undeniable the moment Ava Brooks pushed the page just a little farther forward, not enough for the jury to fully read every line, but enough for the heading to become visible, bold, official, unmistakable in its format. And as Officer Daniel Hayes's eyes locked onto it, something inside his expression finally gave way, not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to itself outright, but in a subtle unraveling, a hesitation that had not existed before, the kind that appears when certainty meets something it cannot immediately control. Ava did not rush to speak. She allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for that realization to settle, for the room to feel the fracture before understanding it. The judge leaned forward. Further now, his attention fixed, pen no longer moving. Waiting, Hayes's throat tightened slightly as he tried to maintain composure, his posture still upright, but no longer grounded in the same confidence. Ava's voice came again, calm, even, but now carrying a clarity that cut through the room with precision. "You testified that I provided no identification," she said, not asking, not challenging, simply restating what had already been sealed into the record. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come as easily this time. There was a pause, small but visible. Ava continued before he could fully recover. "And yet," she added, her tone unchanged, "this document reflects otherwise." Her fingers tapped lightly on the page. Once, a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have. Hayes glanced down again, longer this time, scanning, processing, the lines in his face tightening as recognition began to take hold. The jurors leaned forward almost in unison now, their attention no longer passive observers, but active participants in a moment that was beginning to turn. The prosecution attorney shifted in their seat, eyes narrowing, sensing that the direction of the case was no longer stable. Ava watched Hayes carefully, her expression composed, but there was no longer any doubt in her presence, no uncertainty, only quiet confirmation. "This is a record of identification presented at the scene," she said, her voice steady, each word placed with intention, logged, time-stamped, and verified. The courtroom seemed to contract around those words, the air tightening, the silence sharpening. Hayes lifted his gaze again, but this time it carried something new, not just hesitation, but the beginning of realization, the kind that arrives too late to prevent its consequences. Ava did not press harder. She did not raise her voice. She simply held the moment, allowing it to expand on its own. "Would you like to revise your statement?" she asked, and even then it did not sound like a demand. It sounded like an opportunity, one that was already slipping away. Hayes's jaw tightened again, his eyes flickering between Ava and the document, between the narrative he had built and the evidence now resting in front of him. The balance of the room had shifted completely, no longer tilted in his favor, no longer anchored to his words, but suspended in a new space where certainty had to be earned, not assumed. The judge's voice finally broke the silence, measured, controlled. "Officer Hayes," he said, his tone carrying a new weight, one that reflected the change everyone could now feel. "You will answer the question." And in that moment, with the room holding still, with every gaze fixed on him, it was clear that the story he had begun was no longer his to control. The room did not move, not even when the judge's words settled into the silence, because everyone understood that whatever came next would not simply answer a question. It would confirm something far larger. Officer Daniel Hayes stood still, but the stillness no longer carried authority. It carried weight, the kind that pressed down from within. His gaze dropped once more to the document in front of him, this time not as a reflex, not as a glance, but as a necessity, his eyes tracing the lines more carefully now, slower, as if searching for something that might still give him ground to stand on. But the longer he looked, the less certain that ground seemed to become. Ava Brooks did not interrupt. She did not fill the silence. She allowed it to expand, to surround him, to make the moment unavoidable. The jurors leaned forward, their earlier notes forgotten, their attention now fixed entirely on the space between Hayes and the page. The prosecution attorney shifted again, a subtle movement that betrayed a growing awareness that the structure of the case was no longer holding. Hayes inhaled, a measured breath, but it did not carry the same control as before. It lingered, caught somewhere between decision and realization. He began, but the word did not complete itself. It faded, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than anything spoken. Ava's eyes remained steady, not pressing, not urging, simply present, as if she had already accepted whatever answer would come. Because the answer itself was no longer the point. The truth had already begun to surface. Hayes lifted his gaze again, but now it met not just Ava's eyes, but the entire room, the judge watching, the jurors waiting, the quiet expectation filling every corner. And for the first time, his voice carried something different, not confidence, not authority, but hesitation. "It is possible," he said slowly, carefully, each word chosen with effort, "that I may not have fully reviewed all materials at the time." The statement hung in the air, fragile, incomplete, an attempt to adjust without admitting, to step back without fully turning. But the shift was already clear. The certainty he had built was no longer intact. Ava gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if the moment had reached exactly where it was meant to go. She moved then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, her hand reaching inside the folder once more, retrieving something smaller this time, something solid. She placed it gently on the table, letting it rest there without drawing immediate attention. But the movement itself was enough. Hayes's eyes followed, drawn again despite himself, and this time when he looked, there was no delay in recognition, no space left for reinterpretation. Ava did not rush to explain. She simply let the object sit in the light, its presence speaking before any words needed to. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but the clarity within it was unmistakable. "My identification was not missing," she said, each word precise, measured. It was recorded. She let the statement settle, then added, just enough to complete the thought, and it was recognized. The courtroom seemed to hold that final word longer than the others, recognized, because it did not just refer to the document. It referred to something larger, something that could no longer be dismissed or overlooked. Hayes did not respond immediately, his posture still upright, but no longer steady. The balance of the room had shifted beyond recovery, and as the silence closed in once more, deeper than before, it was no longer a question of what had happened, but of what could no longer be denied. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the weight of what had just been placed on the table did not need explanation. It carried its own meaning, its own authority. Ava Brooks remained still, her hand resting lightly beside the identification now fully visible under the courtroom lights, its surface reflecting a quiet, unmistakable truth that could no longer be redirected or softened. The judge leaned back slowly, his expression no longer neutral but measured, recalibrated, as if the entire framework of the case had shifted beneath him and he was now seeing it from a different height. The jurors exchanged glances, not uncertain anymore, but aware. Aware that what they had been given earlier as certainty had begun to unravel piece by piece, Officer Daniel Hayes stood where he was, but the space around him felt different now, no longer reinforcing his presence but exposing it. His posture still upright out of habit, but the confidence that once filled it had receded, leaving something quieter behind, something that did not hold the same weight. Ava did not press further. She did not need to. The moment had already crossed its threshold, and anything more would have been unnecessary. Her gaze moved briefly from Hayes to the judge, then to the jury, acknowledging the room not as an audience but as witnesses to something that had revealed itself without force. The judge cleared his throat softly, the sound deliberate, grounding. "The record will reflect the submitted documentation," he said, his voice steady, but now carrying a tone that recognized the shift, not announcing it, but accepting it. A clerk reached forward to collect the document, handling it carefully, as if its presence demanded a different kind of attention than anything before it. Hayes's eyes followed the movement, but he did not speak again, not because he could not, but because the space for his version had narrowed to something too small to stand on. Ava drew a slow breath, steady and quiet, her shoulders remaining relaxed, her composure unchanged from the moment she first spoke. But now it carried a different meaning, no longer contained, no longer waiting, but resolved. The tension that once filled the room did not break. It dissolved, replaced by a clarity that settled in slowly, like light adjusting after a storm passes. Ava reached for the folder, closing it with the same precision she had opened it, aligning its edges, restoring its simplicity, as if what it contained had already done its work. She rose then, not abruptly, not with emphasis, but with the natural motion of someone whose role in the moment had reached its end. The sound of her chair moving back was soft, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried through the room like a quiet signal that something had concluded. Hayes remained where he stood, his gaze lowered now, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. The judge watched Ava for a brief second. As she stepped away from the table, his expression unreadable but no longer distant, as if he too understood that what had occurred was not simply procedural, but something that would remain long after the session ended. Ava walked toward the exit at an even pace, her steps measured, unhurried, the sound of them echoing faintly against the polished floor. No one stopped her, no one called out. Because there was nothing left to question, the door opened quietly, letting in a thin line of natural light that cut across the otherwise controlled brightness of the courtroom. And as she passed through it, the space behind her did not fill with noise or reaction. It remained still, held in a silence that felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, like a truth had been spoken without needing to be raised. And as the door closed softly behind her, the room was left not with what had been said, but with what could no longer be undone.